Ruth Ann stepped down from the stagecoach, and the dust of Promise Creek, Montana Territory, settled on her like a second skin. It was a fine, gritty powder that coated her worn gray dress and worked its way into the lines around her eyes. The town was little more than a single street carved from the vast, unforgiving prairie, a collection of raw timber buildings staring at each other under a sky too big for its own good. Men stopped their conversations to watch her, their eyes lingering, assessing. She felt their gazes like a physical weight, the same weight she had felt for the last 1,000 miles. She was cargo, delivered and accounted for. He was waiting, just as the letter had promised. Bridger Calloway. He stood apart from the others, a man made of the same hard lines as the mountains on the horizon. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader in the shoulder, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun too long. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took her in without a flicker of welcome. There was no kindness in them, only appraisal. He was buying a horse, checking its teeth and legs for weakness. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. She had used her mother's name for the correspondence, a small, fragile shield. "I am," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. She clutched her single, battered valise, the handle smooth and worn from her desperate grip. It contained everything she owned in the world. He gave a curt nod. "The name is Calloway. The wagon's over here." He didn't offer to take her bag. He simply turned and walked away, expecting her to follow. She did, her legs stiff from the long journey, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. This was it. This was her last chance. A mail-order bride, a practical arrangement for a man who needed a woman to run his house, and a woman who needed to disappear. The ride to his ranch was silent. The wagon wheels groaned, the horses blew softly through their noses, and the vast empty land stretched out around them. He did not speak, and Ruth Ann did not dare to. She watched his hands on the reins, large and calloused, capable. He handled the team with an economy of motion that spoke of immense strength held in careful reserve. He was a powerful man, she could see that. Powerful and closed, a fortress with no windows. The Calloway Ranch was a kingdom unto itself, nestled in a wide valley with a creek snaking through it like a silver ribbon. A massive barn, corrals teeming with fine-boned horses, and a sprawling ranch house built of sturdy pine logs stood against the encroaching wilderness. It was impressive, prosperous, and achingly lonely. As they drew closer, she saw the house was well built but neglected. The porch was unswept, the windows were dull with dust, and the flower beds by the steps were choked with weeds. It was a place that had lost its heart. A small girl was sitting on the top step of the porch, clutching a rag doll. She had Bridger's dark hair and solemn eyes. She watched them approach without moving, a tiny, unsmiling sentinel. "Hattie," Bridger said, his voice softer than before but still strained. "This is Mrs. Miller. She'll be staying." The child, Hattie, just stared at Ruth Ann, her gaze old and judging. There was no welcome here, either. Only a deep, quiet grief that seemed to fill the very air around the house. Ruth Ann's own grief, the one she kept locked away, stirred in recognition. The circuit preacher was a thin, reedy man with a perpetually worried expression. He arrived the next day, and the wedding was conducted in the cold front parlor. The words were spoken, a transaction completed in the eyes of God and the law. Bridger stood beside her, a wall of silent duty. He did not touch her, not even when the preacher declared them man and wife. He simply nodded, his jaw tight, and handed the man a silver dollar. That night, he showed her to a room at the far end of the hall from his own. It was a simple, clean space with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the dark prairie. "This will be yours," he said, his voice flat. He stood in the doorway, a formidable shadow. The household is your domain. Hattie is your charge. My men eat at sunup and sundown. Do not expect more from me than what we agreed upon. I won't, she promised, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. He hesitated for a moment, as if there was something else he wanted to say, something he was fighting. But the moment passed. He turned and walked away, the sound of his boots echoing down the long, empty hall. Ruth Ann closed the door and leaned against it, the wood cool against her cheek. She was Mrs. Calloway now, a bride in a stranger's house, married to a man of stone, mother to a child of sorrow. She was safe from her past, but she had never felt more alone. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury she had given up long ago. Instead, she unpacked her valise, folded her few belongings, and prepared to earn her keep. The days fell into a rhythm. Ruth Ann rose before dawn, lighting the stove, mixing dough for biscuits, putting coffee on to boil. She worked with a quiet, tireless efficiency that was its own form of silence. She cleaned the house, scrubbing away the layers of dust and neglect until the pine floors shone and the windows sparkled. She pulled the weeds from the flower beds and planted the few seeds she'd carried with her. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to breathe life back into the hollow spaces of the house. Hattie was her shadow, a small, ghost-like presence who watched everything Ruth Ann did from a distance. The child never spoke to her, but her eyes followed Ruth Ann's every move. Ruth Ann did not push. She knew that some wounds could not be rushed. She simply went about her work, humming the old, sad lullabies her own mother had sung to her. She mended the torn dress on Hattie's rag doll, leaving it on the girl's pillow without a word. The next day, she saw Hattie clutching the doll, her small fingers tracing the neat, even stitches. Bridger remained a mystery. He was a constant presence, the center of gravity around which the entire ranch revolved, yet he was utterly remote. He ate the meals she prepared, his eyes on his plate. He wore the shirts she mended, never acknowledging the careful work. He would watch her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unreadable. She felt his gaze from across the yard as she hung laundry, or from the doorway of the barn as she spoke softly to a nervous mare. He saw her competence, her tireless work, but he made no move to bridge the chasm between them. The bargain held. She was the mistress of his house, not of his heart. She learned about his first wife, Sarah, from the whispers of the ranch hands and the cold civility of the women in town. Sarah had been beautiful, vibrant, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. She had died giving birth to Hattie. The whole town knew that Bridger Calloway had closed himself off that day, padlocking the doors to his own heart and throwing away the key. He had married Ruth Ann for his daughter, they said. A plain, quiet woman who would make no demands on a heart that had nothing left to give. Ruth Ann heard the whispers and said nothing. They were right. She had come here to be invisible, to be useful. She had not come here for love. One morning, about a month after her arrival, the dawn was shattered by a sound of pure panic. A mare's frantic, high-pitched scream from the pasture nearest the house. Ruth Ann ran to the porch, her heart pounding. Out in the hazy morning light, a lean gray coyote was circling a newborn foal. The foal, still wet and unsteady on its spindly legs, huddled against its terrified mother. The mare kicked and snapped, but the coyote was patient, cunning, waiting for its moment. Ranch hands were shouting from the far corrals, too distant to help in time. She saw Bridger burst from the barn, his face a mask of cold fury, running toward the house. He was going for the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. He would never make it. The coyote was closing in. Something inside Ruth Ann shifted. A cold, familiar calm settled over her, pushing aside the fear. She didn't think. She acted. She ran inside, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She lifted the heavy hunting rifle from its pegs. It was a Winchester, well-oiled and perfectly balanced. The weight of it felt natural in her hands, a terrifying and forbidden comfort. Back on the porch, she raised the rifle to her shoulder, settling the stock against her cheek. The world narrowed to the small brass bead of the front sight. The distance was at least 80 yards. The wind was still. She let out a slow, steady breath, just as her father had taught her. She didn't see a coyote. She saw a target. She saw survival. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Out in the pasture, the coyote leaped into the air, twisted, and fell in a heap, utterly still. The sudden silence was deafening. The mare nuzzled her foal, trembling. The ranch hands had stopped in their tracks, staring. Bridger skidded to a halt at the bottom of the porch steps, the rifle he'd been running for forgotten in his hand. He stared at the dead coyote, then at her. His face was a storm of disbelief and suspicion. He walked slowly up the steps, his eyes never leaving hers. They were not cold now. They were burning. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The cold calm shattered and terror rushed back in. Her hands started to shake. The rifle suddenly felt alien and heavy. She lowered it, leaning it against the porch rail as if it were poison. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a genuine, desperate fear. The truth was a loaded gun pointed at the fragile piece she had built. I don't know," she stammered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "I've never held a rifle before in my life. It must have been luck. An act of God." He stared at her for a long, silent moment. He knew. She could see it in his eyes. He knew it wasn't luck. A shot like that was not luck. But he didn't challenge her. He gave a single, sharp nod, his expression hardening again into an unreadable mask. He turned and walked down the steps. "See to the carcass," he called out to one of his men. He didn't look back at her. But everything had changed. The lie lay between them, a dead thing in the center of their marriage, as still and silent as the coyote in the field. The shot changed the way Bridger looked at her. The quiet appraisal was now edged with a sharp, searching intensity. He watched her more than ever, not with suspicion, but with a kind of baffled curiosity. He was a man who understood horses, cattle, and the land. He did not understand the quiet woman in his house who could handle a rifle like a seasoned hunter and then deny it with trembling lips. A few nights later, he found her in the parlor long after Hattie was asleep. She was carefully cleaning the Winchester, her movements deft and sure. She had a small tin of oil and a clean rag, and she worked with a focused grace that was almost hypnotic. The lamplight caught the concentration in her face, softening its plainness into something like beauty. She was so absorbed in her task, she didn't hear him approach. "You take good care of things," he said from the doorway. She jumped, a small gasp escaping her lips. The cleaning rod clattered against the floor. She looked up at him, her face pale, caught in the act of tending to a skill she had disowned. Her hands fumbled as she tried to gather the cleaning supplies, her previous grace deserting her entirely. It should be kept clean," she stammered. "In case of emergencies." He walked into the room and picked up the rifle, testing its weight. He looked from the weapon to her, his gaze unwavering. "There are no emergencies that require that kind of care," he said, his voice low. He wasn't accusing her, merely stating a fact. He was giving her an opening to tell him the truth. Ruth Ann's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to unburden herself of the secrets that weighed her down. But fear was an older, more powerful companion. Fear whispered that the truth would cost her this fragile safety, this home she was so desperately trying to build. She looked down at her hands. "I just do what needs doing, Mr. Calloway." He held her gaze for another moment, then sighed, a barely audible sound of frustration. He placed the rifle back on its pegs above the mantelpiece. "Bridger," he said gruffly. "My name is Bridger." He turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the scent of gun oil and the heavy weight of her secrets. He had asked for her trust, in his own way, and she had been unable to give it. The next Sunday, they went to the small clapboard church in town. It was the first time Ruth Ann had gone with him. As she sat beside him and Hattie on the hard wooden pew, she felt the eyes of the town on her. The whispers followed her like flies. The minister spoke of honesty and truth, and Ruth Ann felt each word like a brand. After the service, a woman approached them. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a fine blue dress that must have come all the way from St. Louis. Her name was Elspeth Thorne. She was the daughter of the neighboring rancher, the woman everyone had assumed Bridger would marry, the woman he should have married. "Bridger," Elspeth said, her voice like honey laced with venom. She ignored Ruth Ann completely, placing a proprietary hand on Bridger's arm. "I was so sorry to hear I'd missed the wedding." She finally turned her cool eyes on Ruth Ann. "And this must be the new Mrs. Calloway. I hear you're quite the marvel. Saved a foal, they say. Such a lucky shot." The words were sharp, meant to sting. Ruth Ann felt herself shrink under the woman's disdainful gaze. She looked at the ground, her face burning. Before she could find her voice, Bridger spoke. His tone was flat and cold. "It wasn't luck, Elspeth. It was skill. She saved my property. That's what matters." He gently removed Elspeth's hand from his arm. "Ruth Ann, Hattie, the wagon is ready." He had defended her. It was not a passionate defense, but it was a public one. He had claimed her skill, even when she denied it herself. On the ride home, he was as silent as ever, but something had shifted. He had drawn a line in the dust, placing her on his side of it. When they got back to the ranch, he lifted a sleeping Hattie from the wagon and carried her inside. Ruth Ann followed, her heart a confusing mix of gratitude and fear. His protection felt like a kindness she didn't deserve, a debt she could never repay. The slow burn of their arrangement continued, marked by small, unspoken gestures. He began to talk to her, not just about household matters, but about the ranch. He told her about the bloodlines of his horses, the challenges of the coming winter. He started to look for her when he came in from the fields, his eyes scanning the house until they found her. One evening, she was in the pantry, trying to reach a jar of preserves on the highest shelf. She stood on a rickety crate, stretching, her fingers just brushing the cool glass. The crate wobbled. She cried out, a small startled sound as she lost her balance. Suddenly, he was there. Strong hands gripped her waist, steadying her, lifting her clear off the crate and setting her firmly on the floor. His touch was electric. It was the first time he had held her, truly held her, since their cold, impersonal wedding. She stood frozen in his grasp, her back pressed against his chest. She could feel the heat of him, the solid strength of his body. She could smell the scent of leather and dust and clean sweat that clung to him. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. The small, dark pantry was suddenly charged with a tension so thick she could taste it. He let her go as abruptly as he had caught her. He took a step back, his face a shuttered mask, his jaw working. "Be careful," he said, his voice thick and rough. He turned and strode out of the pantry without another word. The next morning, when Ruth Ann went to the pantry, there was a small, sturdy step stool sitting just inside the door. It was new, made of freshly cut pine, the joints smooth and perfect. He had built it for her. He had seen her need and met it, without a word. She ran her hand over the smooth wood, a strange, warm feeling spreading through her chest. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. It felt dangerously like hope. Her tentative connection with Hattie began to deepen. Ruth Ann found the little girl crying quietly in the barn one afternoon. She didn't ask what was wrong. She simply sat down in the hay beside her and began to tell a story her own mother used to tell, about a star who fell in love with a lonely pine tree on a mountainside. Hattie stopped crying and listened, her solemn eyes fixed on Ruth Ann's face. From that day on, the stories became a ritual, a quiet time in the late afternoon when the wall around the little girl's heart seemed to lower, just a little. Bridger would often appear in the barn doorway during these moments, listening from the shadows, his expression softened by something Ruth Ann had never seen there before. Elspeth Thorne, however, was not one to accept defeat. Spurned by Bridger's public defense of his new wife, she became a woman with a mission. She saw Ruth Ann not just as an obstacle, but as an insult. She began to ask questions in town, sending letters to contacts back east, trying to unearth the history of the plain, quiet woman who had stolen her place. She fed the town's gossip mill, painting Ruth Ann as a coarse, unladylike creature, an unnatural woman who handled guns better than she handled conversation. The threat arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a man with a tin star and a weary face. He was a U.S. Marshal named Reed, and he was passing through Promise Creek on his way to Fort Benton. He stopped at the saloon for a drink, and Elspeth, who seemed to have an almost supernatural sense for opportunity, made sure to be at the general store across the street. The marshal had a poster in his saddlebag. It was old and creased, for a man named Dead-Eye Danvers, wanted for robbery and worse. The poster mentioned he had a daughter, known to be as skilled with a rifle as he was. The marshal was talking about it, a cold case he was finally closing, when Ruth Ann came out of the mercantile. He saw her, and his eyes narrowed. He had been chasing Danvers for years, had seen sketches of the daughter. She was older now, thinner, but the eyes were the same. He walked across the dusty street, his spurs ringing with purpose. Elspeth followed at a discreet distance, her face alight with vicious triumph. "Ma'am," the marshal said, stopping in front of her. "I knew a girl who looked a lot like you down in the Cimarron, daughter of a man named Danvers." Ruth Ann froze. The world tilted on its axis. The blood drained from her face, leaving her as pale as bone. All the air went out of her lungs. The past she had run so far and so fast from had finally caught her. Her father. Dead-Eye. Danvers. The name was a curse she had tried to shed like a snake's skin. She had been his accomplice, his tool, forced to use the skill he'd beaten into her to help him survive. She had run the first chance she got, after he was killed in a shootout, taking a new name, seeking a life of quiet decency. I don't know who you mean," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't you?" the marshal said, his voice hard. He looked around at the gathering crowd, at Elspeth's smug face. "Folks, it seems Bridger Calloway's new bride is none other than Ruthie Danvers, the daughter of one of the most wanted outlaws in the territory." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The whispers started immediately, ugly and venomous. Outlaw's daughter. A killer's blood. Living under a false name. Deceiving them all. Elspeth smiled, a thin, cruel slash in her beautiful face. She had won. She had exposed the interloper for what she was. Ruth Ann stood alone in the street, the town's judgment raining down on her like stones. She looked around for a friendly face and found none. She was an outcast once more. The brand she had tried so hard to escape was now burned onto her skin for all to see. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a nightmare. Bridger had been in the land agent's office and had come out to find his wife at the center of a hostile crowd. He had simply taken her arm, his face a thundercloud, and led her to the wagon. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence was louder than any accusation. It was the silence of betrayal, of a trust broken. When they arrived, he went straight to the barn, leaving her to face the cold, empty house alone. Hattie watched her from the porch, her small face filled with confusion and fear. She had heard the whispers in town. Ruth Ann wanted to go to her, to comfort her, but she felt unclean, unworthy. The shame was a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. For 2 days, Bridger avoided her. He took his meals with the ranch hands. He spoke to her only in clipped, necessary sentences about the running of the house. He was a block of ice, colder and more distant than he had been when she first arrived. He retreated back into the fortress of his grief and his pride, and this time the walls were higher than ever. He was the most respected man in the territory, and she had brought the stain of the gallows to his name. Ruth Ann knew what was coming. He was a man of honor. He could not live with a lie, with a woman whose very name was a crime. He would send her away. It was the only logical, sensible thing to do. He had to protect his daughter, his reputation. The bargain was broken. She moved through her chores in a daze of misery. The house she had brought back to life now felt like a tomb. The small comforts she had built, the smell of baking bread, the clean floors, the mended curtains, were all monuments to a life she was about to lose. The hope that had begun to bloom in her chest withered and died. Section. That night she went to her room and packed her small valise. It didn't take long. She laid out the simple dress she had arrived in. She would leave before dawn. She would not force him to say the words. She would slip away and spare him the trouble of casting her out. It was the last service she could perform for him, the only way she could repay the brief, fragile kindness he had shown her. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, the packed bag at her feet, and waited for the night to end. The silence of the house was absolute, a crushing weight of despair. This was her lowest point, the moment she had been running from her whole life, utterly alone, with nowhere left to go. The sound came just after midnight, a splintering crash from the front of the house, followed by the drunken, jeering laughter of men. Ruth Ann's head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. She crept to her window and peered out. In the pale moonlight she saw 3 men on the porch. One was Elspeth's brother, a useless bully named Finn Thorne. The other 2 were ranch hands he ran with, men with more muscle than sense. They were drunk, and they were emboldened by the town's righteous anger. "Come on out, outlaw girl," Finn shouted, kicking the front door again. "We're here to give you a proper Promise Creek welcome." Panic seized her. Bridger was gone. He'd ridden out to a line shack on the north pasture after supper, checking on a sick cow. He wouldn't be back until morning. She was alone with Hattie. A small whimper came from the hallway. Hattie stood there, clutching her rag doll, her eyes wide with terror. Ruth Ann's own fear was a cold, sick thing in her stomach, but the sight of the terrified child sparked something else inside her, a fierce, protective fire. She would not let them harm this child. "Hattie, listen to me," she whispered, her voice urgent but calm. "Go to my room, crawl under the bed and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" The little girl nodded, her face white, and scurried away. Ruth Ann took a deep, steadying breath. She ran not to the back door to flee, but to the parlor. Her hands, steady now, lifted the Winchester from its pegs. She checked the action, sliding a cartridge into the chamber. The familiar mechanics were a comfort, a language her body understood better than words. This was not about her past anymore. This was about protecting her home. She slipped through the dark house to the kitchen window, which gave her a clear view of the porch. Finn Thorne was brandishing a bottle, taking a long swig. "We'll teach her to lie to good folk," he crowed. One of his friends pulled a pistol from his belt, waving it carelessly. Ruth Ann raised the rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill. The cold calm descended again. The world narrowed. She did not aim to kill. Her father had been a killer. She would not be. She aimed to stop. Her first shot was a deafening blast in the night. The whiskey bottle in Finn's hand exploded, showering him with liquor and glass. He screamed, dropping what was left of the bottle and stumbling back. The second shot was a sharp crack, and the pistol was torn from the other man's hand, spinning into the darkness of the yard. The third shot slammed into the porch post right beside the third man's head, sending a spray of splinters into his face. 3 shots, fired in less than 5 seconds. Precise, controlled, terrifying. The men froze, sobered instantly by the deadly display of skill. They stared into the dark windows of the house, suddenly aware they were not dealing with a frightened woman, but with a force they could not comprehend. It was into this sudden, tense silence that a new sound intruded, the thunder of a horse galloping hard. Bridger. He burst into the yard, pulling his stallion to a rearing halt. He must have seen the light of their torches from the ridge. He swung down from the saddle, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury. He took in the scene in a single glance, the terrified men on his porch, the shattered bottle, the gun in the dirt, and the rifle barrel still resting on the kitchen windowsill. He didn't look at the window with anger or disgust. He looked at it with a kind of raw, staggering awe. He turned to Finn Thorne and his cronies, his voice a low, deadly growl. "Get off my land," he said. The men scrambled to obey, tripping over each other in their haste to escape. Bridger took a step after them. "And if you ever come near my wife again," he called out, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, "I will bury you where you stand." My wife. He had said it. Not as a title, not as a legal fact, but as a claim. A threat. A promise. He watched until they were gone, then he turned and walked slowly up the steps and into the house. He found her in the kitchen, leaning the rifle against the wall. She was shaking now, the adrenaline leaving her weak. Hattie ran from the hallway and threw her arms around Ruth Ann's legs, sobbing. Ruth Ann sank to her knees and held the child tight, burying her face in her hair. Bridger stopped in the doorway, his powerful frame filling it. He looked at the woman and child clinging to each other in the lamplight. "My father?" Ruth Ann began, her voice choked with tears and shame. "He was a terrible man. He taught me. He made me." Bridger crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt in front of her. He gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. The ice was gone. The walls were gone. In their place was something raw and vulnerable, something she had never seen in him before. "I don't care who your father was, Ruth Ann," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I care who you are. Tonight, you were the woman who saved my daughter, the woman who defended my home." He reached out and brushed a stray tear from her cheek with his thumb. "The woman who saved me." In that moment, the rescue was complete, and it was mutual. She had saved his home from attack. He had saved her from her past. He had stood against the world for her, and she had become the fierce guardian of his. A week passed. The town of Promise Creek was quiet, the story of the attack on the Callaway Ranch spreading like wildfire. Bridger's unwavering defense of his wife had silenced the gossips. Elspeth Thorne was seen packing a trunk into her father's carriage, her face tight with humiliation. No one dared to meet Ruth Ann's eyes with anything but a grudging respect. The following Sunday, Bridger took her to church. As they walked up the steps, he placed his hand on the small of her back, a simple, public gesture of possession and pride that spoke louder than any words. He was claiming her in front of them all, and no one dared to challenge him. Hattie walked between them, holding both their hands. The house was no longer a cold, empty place. It was filled with the sound of Hattie's laughter. The little girl, who had once been a silent ghost, now chattered endlessly, following Ruth Ann everywhere, calling her Mama, with an easy, natural affection that mended something broken deep inside Ruth Ann's soul. The fortress around Bridger's heart had crumbled for good. He talked to Ruth Ann constantly now, sharing the burdens and triumphs of the ranch. He sought her opinion on which stallion to breed, which fields to leave fallow. He discovered she had a keen mind for numbers and a strategic intelligence that saw patterns he missed. She was not just the mistress of his house, she was his partner. The physical space between them vanished as well. He no longer hesitated to touch her, a hand on her shoulder as he passed, fingers brushing hers as she handed him a cup of coffee. Each touch was a confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in fear and fire. One evening, they sat on the porch swing as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the mountains in hues of purple and gold. Hattie was asleep inside, worn out from a day of chasing butterflies. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, the gentle creak of the swing the only sound. "I was a dead man walking, Ruth Ann," Bridger said finally, his voice low and full of a deep, resonant emotion. He stared out at the land, his land, but he was seeing something else entirely. "When Sarah died, the world went gray. I just kept going. For Hattie, for the ranch. But I wasn't living." He turned to look at her, his winter sky eyes filled with a warmth that made her breath catch. "You brought this house back to life. You brought Hattie back to life." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "You brought me back." She could not speak. The words were too big, the feelings too new. She simply squeezed his hand, her heart full to bursting. This was more than safety. This was more than a bargain. This was home. Later that night, he came to her room. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and stood there, a silhouette against the hall light. He carried a pillow in one hand. He said nothing, simply walked to her bed, placed his pillow beside hers, and began to unbutton his shirt. It was not a gesture of raw demand, but one of quiet, irreversible choice. It was an admission of need, a final surrender. He was choosing her, not just as a defender of his home or a mother to his child, but as his wife, in every sense of the word. She watched him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of peace. The frontier was still a wild and dangerous place, but here, in this room, with this man, she had found her shelter. She had started as discarded cargo, a woman with a shameful secret and no future. Now she was the cherished heart of a home, loved by a good man and a sweet child. Her hidden strength, the skill that had once been her curse, had become their salvation. She had not been rescued by a prince. She had earned her place with courage and a steady hand, and in doing so, had healed a broken king. As he lay down beside her and pulled the quilt over them both, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally, truly home.